There's a moment at the climax of Destiny 2's Final Shape expansion that's been widely praised, and I share those praises. However, I also think it's emblematic of a wider problem with the game's narrative canon. To unpack why, we need to explore the theory behind games as a narrative medium, and why game developers tell stories in the ways they do. Spoilers for the Final Shape and every story that precedes it. Games as an interactive medium pose a major complication for narrative storytellers. They can't be written in exactly the same way you would write a novel or screenplay, because the person consuming the work takes an active role. Games usually ask players to control aspects of the game world, an avatar, or a character. These interactions create a chain of events that themselves become a story. This story, created through the player's choices, is called the ludonarrative. Ludo meaning to play, and narrative meaning story. In games that present the player with a plot to follow that unfolds throughout, the ludonarrative exists separately from the scripted narrative. The ludonarrative can either be very simple or very complex, depending on the level of interactivity, and likewise, the scripted narrative can equally be simple or complex, depending on the writing and number of paths available. If you're following me so far, you might understand that it's possible for these two narratives to conflict, making statements that seem to be in opposition to each other. A game displaying this kind of inner conflict is said to have ludonarrative dissonance. The popularization of this term in games criticism has made it an oft-trotted out horse that's slowly been beaten to death under the paradigm that the presence of dissonance is usually a bad thing. The essay that coined the term, Ludonarrative Dissonance in BioShock by Clint Hawking, is ostensibly considering the dissonance as a pitfall to be avoided by developers. BioShock is a game about Randian objectivism, which asks the player to weigh whether helping others or behaving purely in a self-interested fashion is more moral. The narrative is highly concerned with this question, as the main antagonist is an objectivist. The ludonarrative contends with this question via the Little Sister system. The player is asked whether they should harvest little sisters and profit more, or spare them but miss out on more of the game's atom currency. This allows the player to weigh this question directly through their gameplay choices. The dissonance comes when the scripted narrative forces the player to help a character called Atlas, and doesn't provide an option to ignore him and purely serve your self-interest. This creates a dissonance, where the player cannot directly choose to engage with the text purely on a self-interested or selfless basis. This is a problem because it undermines both narratives, weakening them as a result. Hawking's point is that you cannot seamlessly engage with the story and gameplay at the same time without contradictions. Destiny's Light and Darkness saga has a similar problem. A central theme within the Light and Darkness saga is the conflict between subjugating other people to your will through violence, and letting your ideas do the talking to create a coalition born of free will. Destiny, unlike BioShock, contains no gameplay systems allowing players to directly weigh this question. I argue there's still an inherent dissonance between the narrative of building a coalition to defeat tyranny and the gameplay systems which force the player to kill the Witness and the forces of the Black Fleet, rather than attempt to convince them to change their minds. The only path provided to the player when encountering any adversary is to kill them and thus subjugate them to your will through violence, the very idea the player is ostensibly fighting to defeat. As my girlfriend succinctly said when I was explaining this to her, this is a weird philosophy to challenge in a game about fighting. Moreover, the gameplay systems make this subjugation immensely satisfying, furthering the dissonance. Bungie's narrative team seems to be aware of the fact that Destiny doesn't give the player agency about when to build a coalition and when to strike someone down via violence, only allowing the player to follow predetermined subjugation while arbitrarily stopping the player from killing characters destined for allyship. The most egregious example of this second pattern is the player guardian allowing Amaro to escape during the climax of Witch Queen. While otherwise a fantastic expansion narratively, the gameplay climax of Witch Queen features the greatest ludonarrative dissonance the franchise has ever seen. The player is not given a choice about whether to kill Savathun and her ghost. They are forced to kill Savathun to subjugate her and stop the ritual, instead of trying to ally with the fellow Lightbearer to build a stronger coalition. However, completely taking out Savathun is forbidden, as the writers have determined that her ghost, Amaru, must be allowed to escape so that the Vanguard Coalition can ally with her in the fight against the Witness later during the final shape expansion. The player had already been asked repeatedly to crush hive ghosts throughout the campaign, so destroying an enemy ghost shouldn't have been something the player, or their guardian, hesitated to do by this point. The hesitation in the cutscene feels forced, awkward, and out of character. It's also contrary to the fact that the Guardian has a lot of reasons to want to give Savathun a final death. Researching light in Savathun's song, the Dreaming City curse, imprisoning Osiris, impersonating him, and attacking the last city. Don't get me wrong, I love Savathun as a villain and am glad she wasn't killed off, but there needed to be a stronger narrative justification like a spell to conceal her ghost. By refusing to give players agency, forcing them to arbitrarily subjugate enemies to their will via violence, Destiny 2's Light and Darkness saga creates dissonance between the narrative and ludonarrative. The player is not allowed to weigh the question of subjugation versus coalition building. If you engage with the gameplay but not the story, you will come away with the impression that the Vanguard prefers to use violence to subjugate everyone to their will, while if you engage with the story but not the gameplay, you will come away with the impression that the Vanguard uses diplomacy to build a diverse coalition born of free will to defeat the Witness. This weakens the narrative theme inherent to the saga's story about coalitions formed from diplomacy. For example, the Vanguard's anti-Witness coalition is stronger than the Black Fleet, a coalition formed through violence and subjugation. The apotheosis of this idea, the battle to defeat the Witness during the Final Shape's Excision mission, is substantially weakened by this dissonance. In the Final Shape, the narrative team lampshades this broader issue with player agency in violence by having the Witness draw attention to it.
The sword teaches that what cannot be destroyed will surpass infinity. The hive were lost to this childish game, too obsessed by the violence of the first knife to see the final carving. Are you not also a prisoner of this eternal chase? For all your power, you destroy to receive glittering rewards, the commendations of your peers, triumphant accolades for all to see. We offer you an escape. Embrace this truth. The uplifted, triumphant against entropy.
The Witness breaks the fourth wall, calling the player out for engaging with Destiny in the same fashion that major villains like Oryx engage with violence, doing it for sport, to find purpose, or for the spoils of war. Players are not provided with non-violent options in 99% of situations in Destiny, even though that coalition building philosophy is the very separation between the Vanguard and their enemies. Lampshading the issue doesn't fix it and merely draws attention to the dissonance. In this case, the dissonance feels accidental and not an intentional choice to comment or evoke something. The second main theme we discuss is in an opposite situation, which poses the need for an antonym to ludonarrative dissonance: ludonarrative resonance. The long version is something I explore in my analysis of prismatic and the symmetry, but the short version is the conflict between dogma or black and white thinking and dialectics or shades of gray. The Light and Darkness saga sets up two primary dogmas in opposition to each other. What I call the dogma of light, which says that light is inherently good and the darkness is inherently evil, and what I call the dogma of darkness, which says that the light is inherently evil. The player faction, the Vanguard, starts the saga believing the dogma of light, but eventually realizes this dogma is flawed. In Beyond Light, they learn the darkness can be used for good, and in Witch Queen, they learn that light can be used for evil. This causes a crisis of faith in their doctrine, resulting in a dialectical position between the two dogmas, which rejects the notion that either force has inherent morality, and embraces using both in concert as tools. The gameplay systems resonate with this idea by starting out giving players discrete subclasses, each harnessing an aspect of the light or darkness, but never both at the same time. The opposing dogmas are dialectically rejected in gameplay via prismatic, which allows the player to wield abilities from the light and darkness simultaneously for a greater power than the sum of its parts, achieving transcendence. This creates a fantastic example of ludonarrative resonance. So far, we've been looking at games from the dogmatic position that ludonarrative dissonance is universally bad, while resonance is universally good. However, reality is more complicated. It's possible for a game to make use of ludonarrative dissonance as an intentional tool, challenging the player's conception of what it means to engage with a video game as a text. It's also possible for fear of ludonarrative dissonance and the desire to maintain resonance to hold a game's narrative back. I believe Destiny 2 suffers from this issue. This is a bold claim that's bound to be controversial, so hear me out before you judge the idea. With the release of Destiny, the creative team at Bungie made a choice of great importance. They decided to cast the player-created Guardian as capital TV, capital G Guardian, a character who is one of the most powerful Guardians who have ever lived, as they've defeated the entire pantheon of the Destiny universe's greatest foes. Emergent player actions were also canonized in the lore through seemingly innocuous references in Grimoire cards. Foundational lore surrounding ghosts justified the player's ability to infinitely respawn, even though wipes in darkness zones that make players lose combat progress via death exist, but are not considered canon. Casting all emergent player behavior as canon within the narrative is a cool idea that makes players feel invested in the story because their actions have consequences. However, we don't really have full agency in a game that mainly tells stories in linear narratives with limited to no player agency over the plot. I believe player action as canon was a fair but insidious choice, with great consequences for future narratives, that has effectively limited the tools storytellers can play with in the sandbox of Destiny's narrative. In making player actions canon, Destiny has created a situation where every gameplay choice needs to have a narrative justification. This was fine in the rather limited era of Destiny 1, where the story followed the simplistic dogma of light. However, as the franchise grew into the sprawling live service behemoth of Destiny 2, it gets confusing which aspects of the game are considered canon and which aren't. The first place this canon became a problem was the Red War campaign of vanilla Destiny 2. The Cabal Emperor Gaul encases the Traveler with a light-suppressing machine, which he uses to cut off every Guardian and Ghost's connection to the light. Still being the era where the dogma of light was unimpeachable doctrine, this choice hit hard. Guardians were truly threatened with mortality on screen for the first time. They could be killed much more easily and couldn't draw upon the light to fight the Cabal. This should have been an incredible narrative concept. However, Bungie wanted to justify the player respawning using Ghost and allow the player to use the light toolbox throughout the campaign. So they immediately undercut this decision's impact by giving the player the light back via a Deus Ex Machina, the Shard of the Traveler. I believe the Red War could have been a Final Shape level narrative if Bungie had the courage to buck player action as canon temporarily and force players to be lightless for an extended period. It would truly humble the Guardian in an impactful way and make the player understand that their light is something that can be taken away at a moment's notice. Instead, we got a milquetoast version of this conflict, as the highs of the journey sequence are short-lived and undercut by immediately regaining the light. This issue with the light has reared its head twice more, at the climaxes of Lightfall and the final shape. In the climax of Lightfall, Callus's Shadow Legion assaults the Veil, hoping to claim its power for the Witness. The Guardian fights back and kills Callus, protecting the Veil. However, they bring Ghost along, who the Witness has a demonstrated ability to possess and control involuntarily. Predictably, the Witness possesses Ghost and uses him to connect with the Veil, creating a link to the Traveler, allowing it to open a portal into the Traveler's Pale Heart, where it can enact its endgame of ridding the universe of paracausal light. There's another awkward moment similar to the Amaru example, where the Guardian raises their weapon at Ghost and considers shooting him but hesitates, giving enough time for the communion.
We finally found you.
Get your ghost!
What's wrong, Osiris?
Get your ghost out of there!
Finality takes shape.
It's creating the link!
At long last.
Destroy it!
What just happened?
We just lost.
This example feels less forced because the Guardian has every reason to avoid killing Ghost if possible. He's a companion that served them on their journey from its very beginning, so losing him would be heartbreaking. It would also sever their connection to the Traveler and prevent them from using the light like those first two missions of the Red War. This hesitation causes light to fall, being the reason for the expansion's title. However, this is a dissonant moment, because again the player is not given any agency in the decision of whether to kill or spare Ghost, or pursue some other option to stop the Witness. The Guardian hesitates because the plot demands it, and also losing Ghost would make using light-based abilities conflict with canon in the future. I believe narrative moments like this are the fundamental reason casting the player character as someone of great importance, but limited agency is a flawed decision narratively. The moment might have felt out of character for some players who would have been ruthless enough to sacrifice their most loyal companion in order to stop the Witness. It could also have been in character for others, but the point is that there's no agency in a decision pivotal to the plot of the game. You could easily get around the fact that this would create two diverging timelines by making the choice meaningless, the Witness quickly finding another way to commune with the Veil that the player tries but cannot stop. When I first played Lightfall, my initial reaction was that the moment was powerful but dissonant because my Guardian would have actually pulled the trigger. Light falls on the solar system, not because of any shortcomings of the player, but out of contrivance created by the writers. Again, the lack of true agency is not necessarily a bad thing, because some level of this must be accepted when writing a linear video game narrative, but I think the moment would have hit much harder had the player been given a false choice and forced to live with the consequences. However, the canon problem created by rendering future uses of the light non-canon is another issue, one which I believe the writers were afraid of. However, in the final shape, the Traveler gives the Guardian access to Prismatic, which could have been used as a way to allow Ghost to die and stay dead while also keeping use of the light canon. However, Bungie didn't pursue this action because it would interfere with core gameplay systems that involve using Ghost to do things like going to orbit, accessing a sparrow, or using the light. Alternative methods could also have been devised via the Traveler's blessing in the final shape. A similar moment also happens during the climax of Final Shape, ironically also involving the connection to the Traveler and Ghost's life. During the final moments of Final Shape's ultimate mission, Excision, Ghost calls upon the Traveler's light to kill the Witness in a much more powerful way than ever before. Already injured from the events of Iconoclasm, this heavy exertion kills Ghost. Cade chooses to sacrifice his newly found lease on life to bring Ghost back from the dead, using the light bestowed by Crow's wish to Riven.
No! Ghost? Please. Bring him back. He's just a ghost. You raised an army. You can bring back one ghost.
He sure shined bright back there, huh?
Cade.
What comes from the light returns to the light. My gal Sundance told me that. She also said we're all connected. Guardians, ghosts, the Traveler. Now you tell the others this was my choice. My light. Nobody makes my fate but me. You're my favorite. Don't ever forget that.
Guardian.
This moment is incredibly emotional and potent. I don't think it's a bad way to end the expansion. However, it immediately undermines Ghost's sacrifice by replacing it with Cade's sacrifice, something only possible because of an accidental wish to Riven. After ruminating on this moment for a while, I think it's effective but ultimately flawed. If Ghost truly had died here, the impact of the scene would have been 100 times greater. However, the writers run into the canon problem yet again. Losing Ghost would be a major change to the status quo, preventing the Guardian and the player from using the light and other ghost-based abilities in the future. This would be an incredibly courageous decision that could be walked back slowly, using some other way to call on the Traveler's light in the Pale Heart, but again it would still break the canon justification for respawning. I think this second version of the story would be much stronger because it would involve deeply personal consequences for the player to defeat the Witness. However, I think that the fear of ludonarrative dissonance or invalidating canon was too strong, leading players to get a watered down version of what could have been an extremely strong character moment. It's okay if you disagree with me on this point. I'm not even saying Cade's sacrifice was bad, but it does significantly weaken stakes of a Guardian's final death to introduce a mechanism for resurrecting ghosts and dead Guardians in the story, even if the writers justify it as a one-time thing. Ultimately, ludonarrative dissonance, resonance, and player action as canon are tools in a game developer's toolkit, but ones that come with significant downsides along with their upsides. I'm not trying to be an armchair writer or game developer here, just pointing out a running trend in Destiny's narrative that I think is worth examining with a critical eye. The structural choices made early in the franchise's story, like player action as canon, have made the writers afraid to take big narrative swings that disrupt the status quo, or immediately undermine those swings, weakening the impact. I, as an enjoyer of stories, am always in favor of bold, courageous storytelling, even if it doesn't land perfectly, over stories that feel weak and like an imperfect encapsulation of the themes and message. I hope this is something we see in the non-linear campaign teased for the next expansion in mid-2025. I want a future saga for Destiny that isn't afraid to change the status quo and disrupt what we know about the world and gameplay of Destiny, particularly around Guardians and Ghosts. This video was funded in part by my YouTube members. Becoming a channel member gives you access to perks like early access to videos, your name in the credits, a Discord role, and more. Above all though, thank you to everyone for watching and supporting my content. It helps make videos like this one possible.